Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to share with you how I made this dress. It's a collared gingham dress with a semi-fitted bodice. I used this McCalls pattern and I made option D. The reason why I chose this style was because I have recently fallen in love with midi dresses. I also don't have many casual dresses at this length, so why not? With this design, I love the sleeves able to be worn in two different ways. One being long sleeve for winter or fall, and the other way you can wear it is folded up being a short sleeve for the spring and summer. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this video and I hope you enjoy learning with me as we dive into sewing collars, darts, sleeves and sleeve plackets, as well as sewing buttons and buttonholes to make this dress. As you do with all garment making, I cut out the fabric pieces. I used a blend of fabric scissors and a rotary blade to cut the pieces out. I make sure to cut a fabric notch so it is noticeable for when sewing. I used a heat erasable pen to make notions. This can easily be removed by using an iron over it. And always test heat erasable pens on a sample fabric before using on the fabric itself. I used a pressing cloth to iron the interfacing onto the wrong side of the fabric. Once it was fused, I removed the pins and went over the fabric a second time with ironing the right side of the fabric. I pinned the darts in place with the pins going through the mark lines on both sides. Stitch along the lines as you get to the point of the dart, get as close as you can to the edge, stop, adjust the foot so you sew parallel to the edge and then sew a couple of stitches along. I usually do about 3 to 4 stitches, then back stitch. This gives you a beautiful and professional finish to your dart. I then stitched a 2 cm seam allowance. Stitch from circle to circle on the front neckline to reinforce the neckline. I sewed the back darts the same way I did on the front darts. For step 5, I'm really sorry the video came out blurry. My camera decided to focus on the machine instead. For this step, I sewed a wider stitch at 2 cm on the back shoulder edges between the triangle and the notch. I sewed the shoulder seams together. I didn't really need to use the ease stitch, so I basted the shoulder seams and sewed it all together. I ironed the seams and darts for a neat finish and then went on to sewing the side seams. I put quite a lot of pins in the sides as I wanted to reduce the fabric movement under the foot. I also didn't want that dart to move either while sewing. To finish the seams, I ironed flat and overlocked the seams closed. Along the neck of the bodice, stay stitched from one circle to the other. This step was a bit challenging to get right, but it can be done. What helped me was using a lot of pins, readjusting the corners to match, then holding the fabric in place with my fingers, then moved my fingers away when I felt they were getting a little too close to the machine. For my outfit, we are skipping steps 9, 10, 11 and going straight to step 12. I pinned then sewed the sleeve front to the sleeve back at the seam that goes under the arm. If you aren't quite sure how to check which side to sew, we want to sew the valley together with the 3 trees in it. We don't want to sew the mountain together just yet. I finished the seam allowance with overlocking them open, then pressed with the iron. I folded the sleeve tab, pinned in place, then stitched from the pointed end to the bottom and left the bottom edge open. I trimmed the edges to reduce the bulk, then turned the sleeve tabs right side out, pressed to neaten the overlocked edges and made a buttonhole at the markings. I used my seam ripper to make the hole and pins at each of the edges to prevent over-ripping the buttonhole. Pin the sleeve tabs to the wrong side at the matching circles. I sewed a rectangle along the edge for stability. I did the serger tip method as shown. I overlocked the edges. For some reason this step really confused me. Like, I was questioning, how is this cuff going to stay open? Isn't it just going to fold in on itself when it's all together? Anyway, as confused as I was, I decided to just trust the process. Anyway, I was still confused about it all, so I moved on to making the cuff pleat. I folded the line closest to the undershoulder seam to the other pleat line, then pinned and basted the pleat in place. For making the cuff, I followed method 1, which is the totally flat method. I folded wrong sides together, pinned in place, then ironed over. Pin the cuff to the sleeves, right sides together. When I tried pinning the square notions together, I could not get it to match. The sleeve was too big for the cuff no matter how many times I repinned. So to overcome this problem, I sewed an E-stitch in between the pleat and the seam. I then eased the sleeve edge so it would match the cuff square notions. I put a lot of pins in place afterwards and then sewed the cuff and sleeve together. I pressed the unnotched cuff edge at the next step and didn't trim the edge until later. I pinned the cuff with the fold pinned to and sewed the ends together, making sure to avoid accidentally sewing the sleeve. I trimmed the seam allowance to reduce bulk for when we put in the buttonholes and turned the cuff to the right side. I ironed the seam allowance into the cuff and ironed over the cuff and slip stitched the open closed. The first stitch was fiddly to start, but was easier after with slip stitching. I stitched the remaining sleeve seam all the way to the circle. After this, I then ironed this seam open. I hand stitched the sleeve opening closed. I tried not to sew too much of the cuff fabric as I did not want the hand stitches to be visible on the right side of the fabric. I sewed 2 E-stitches from circle to circle. The small circles on the bodice and sleeve didn't match up even when gathered. I'm not sure if I made a mistake or there's a pattern error. Anyway, I went with it and I only matched the shoulder circles and the notches and it still worked. I adjusted and gathered the basting and pinned the sleeve in place to match the circle notches. I also hand basted the sleeve and bodice shoulder for stability when sewing. I then sewed the sleeve before removing the basting stitches. I then sewed the sleeve together. Before removing the basting stitches, I checked if I was happy with how the sleeve looked. I sewed the pocket on the skirt front. I didn't manage to get a recording of the sewing, but here is what the skirt and pocket look like. Similarly to the previous step, I sewed the skirt back together with the matching notches. I then sewed the pocket to each side, and after this, I overlocked all the sides open before top stitching the pockets. I stitched the front and back skirt pieces together and left an opening for the pocket between the circles. I then stitched the edges together. I ironed the pockets towards the front and basted the pockets to the skirt. I stay stitched the waistline edge of the skirt at about 1 centimetre. I pinned the skirt to the bodice at the waist and matched the notches to the notches and sewed together. So to reinforce the neck edge of the front facing. After I finished, I clipped the fabric to the circle. Stay stitch from the neck edge to just above the circle. I folded the seam allowance of the front facing inside along the seam line as shown and ironed in place. It took me a moment to figure this step out as I was really confused how to align these pieces all together. Anyway, what helped me understand was laying the pieces out the same way as what's shown in the pattern. I pinned together with the notches matching, clipped where needed, like the corners, and then sewed it together. I ironed the neck seams opened. I turned the lower edge of the collar along the seam line and ironed this too. I don't believe I trimmed the seam allowance. I think I just left it at 1.5 centimeters. I matched the notches and edges, then pinned the facing to the dress. I sewed from the circle to the dress hem and sewed the back of the collar on a separate stitch. I clipped the corners to reduce bulk when clipping right sides out. After finishing this step, I noticed there were a few gaps in the collar, so to fix this, I hand sewed the openings closed. After this, I then trimmed all the corners so it's less bulk when flipping it to right sides out. I turned the collar right sides out and ironed for a flatter finish. I slip stitched the collar facings over the seams. I also wanted to finish the button facing as the instructions didn't clearly say how to finish them. So I added in a couple of extra steps by overlocking the edges. I left the top edge as is, as I was keeping that edge folded. When I tried the dress on, I noticed I had to constantly readjust the facing. It would stand out, it wouldn't sit flat when worn as it wasn't anchored in. So I slip stitched the entire facing on the dress. It took a while, but it was worth it as I no longer had to readjust the facing. I flipped the lower edge facing to the outside of the dress. My facing was already slightly shorter. I think this might have been from applying the interfacing, so I didn't need to trim the edge. I pinned this in place, then sewed all the edges together. I trimmed the edges and corner and flipped the facing inside. The first fold was 6 mils and the second fold was 1 centimeter. I measured 1.5 centimeters and ironed all the way around the hem. Then I folded and ironed the second fold within the fold all the way around and pinned the hem in place. This took a really long time, however the finished hem is really worth it. I sewed the buttons on the left side as it's worn on the marking, and on the right side when wearing, I made the buttonholes at the markings too. I started with making a knot and sewing from the wrong side to the right side. I pulled the needle through the shank button and sewed through the fabric layer. I then sewed back to the right layer to further anchor the button and repeat. Once I was finished, I sewed back to the wrong side and anchored, then knotted in place before cutting off the thread. I sewed the button to the sleeve at the center of the tab. I sewed the buttonholes in the cuff at the markings and hand sewed the buttons at the markings too. For this step, all I did was fold the cuff, then used the tab and button to hold the cuff in place. I sewed the buttonholes in the cuff at the markings and hand sewed the buttons at the markings too. I matched the notches on the sash and pinned and sewed together. I pinned the sash right sides together and sewed it, leaving an opening for turning the right sides out. I turned the sash right side out and slip stitched the opening closed. I also top stitched around the edges as I noticed my sash would easily lose shape without it. The dress is now finished and here is the final result. I think it looks amazing and I really enjoyed making it. I hope you guys enjoyed watching me along the way too.